couple things about the syllabus real quick that I should have covered yesterday but did not. I apologize for that. A couple things about the textbooks. Hopefully within about a year and a half from now, if I ever teach this class again, I will have another book to add to the list on Islam. Till then, Understanding the Quran by Mateen Ilyas is an excellent little work if you've had the opportunity of looking at it. There's a lot of stuff out there on Islam, but not a lot of it's overly good. When it comes to resources and things like that, for each of these groups that we're going to be addressing, and most specifically with Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Islam, when it's religious groups, I go to original sources. I read their stuff. That is the stuff that most directly influences me, is primary sources. And secondary sources can be very useful, but you have to use them carefully. You know, when I first started studying Mormonism, I was reading all these Christian books, but then I would see that these books were constantly citing these other sources. That's why I started going to the LDS bookstore and buying those books. And it was when I started reading those books that I really started understanding Mormonism, because it helps you to enter into the way that they think and they speak to one another. Now, I don't suggest that, by the way, for every person who is ministering in the church. You just don't need to go to that depth. When people ask, well, what should the percentage be? What should the breakdown be? I would say 90% your knowledge of your faith, 10% a knowledge of somebody else's. Unless you are doing something like church planting in Utah or Brooklyn or whatever else. In other words, you're going to be in a specific area where there is a heavy concentration. If you're going to, you know, southern Italy, yeah, I know. Thanks. Okay, here. How's that? You know, wrong way. See, this is reversed in the video, and the jacket keeps hitting it. So I may have to lose the, may have to lose the bow tie after a while. It just doesn't want to stay where it's supposed to be. Anyway, so that's what I would suggest in that. So Mateen's book is really good, and it's not just about the Quran. It really does cover a large portion of the rest of the subject of Islam. It's really good. The Atheism Remix book from Brother Al, I listened to the lectures that he gave that became that book. He delivered them at Dallas Theological Seminary. And I just love listening to Al Mohler. I mean, he's just, anybody with a library like that, first of all, is just really cool. But, and we can all hope that, you know, he might donate a part of it to us or something like that. But I enjoyed the lectures, and it's a nice summary. It's, you know, I don't want to go all that in depth in everything Sam Harris has to say. You know what I mean? He did a good job identifying the primary issues there. So I think that's an excellent work. It's always scared me to take classes from people that assign their own books, because then they could always tell if whether I actually read them or not. But especially since two of these subjects I have written on extensively, what can I say? The Roman Catholic controversy is really the older version of my first two books are called The Fatal Flaw and Answers to Catholic Claims. They're with a small publisher, and my Bethany House version is sort of the expansion of that, and hopefully focuses you upon the issues. We might start touching upon some of these late this evening, but probably tomorrow primarily. And then Ismar, My Brother is the second book that I did on Mormonism. The first book I did is called Letters to a Mormon Elder. Letters is the one that goes through the whole range of Mormon beliefs. The Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Pilgrim Price, Temple Ceremonies, Book of Abraham, everything. And it's written in the form of letters. And it's, I know one church up in Utah that just distributed thousands of copies of these as tracts because that's how I designed it. But I also did it so that as you're reading these letters, it would give you an idea how to witness to folks. So why didn't I use that? Well, because Is a Mormon My Brother is a little bit more focused and a little bit more relevant to where ministers are today. And why I say that is that, believe it or not, there are people who are trying to, Mormonism itself is trying to mainstream. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which in the 1950s was more than happy to say, we're the only true Christian church, and they weren't, most Mormons back then wouldn't even call themselves Christians as a regular denominational name. They were more than happy to be unique. But there has been a change over the past number of years. I have seen a massive change between when I first started studying Mormonism in 1983 in depth and the Mormon Church of today. Back then, you could talk to a Mormon kid and they would argue polytheism with you. They would actually be able to go to the Bible and say the Bible teaches there are multiple gods. I mean, the Mormon kids could do that. Now you run into Mormon adults that aren't even aware that they believe in a plurality of gods. There has just been a huge change. And it's not that the theology so much has changed as they went from 3 million to 13 million. And they absolutely failed in what we would call catechesis. They brought all those people in. They had massive growth, but they didn't do a good job in teaching them at all. So it is an interesting situation that we deal with today. Now, I've had some questions concerning the book reviews and things like that. There was a specific question about what format. The format's right there on the syllabus as far as the book review is concerned. You know, spacing, size, everything is right there. So if you haven't gotten the syllabus, is the syllabus on the website? It is? Okay, so you can grab the syllabus there. There were a couple emails that I had from folks online that I wanted to get to. Someone did ask a question. I suppose if someone has taken the time to ask this question, that might mean other people have the same questions. So the first one isn't necessarily directly class related, though I did bring it up. So a bunch of people asked, hey, or at least one person asked, hey, I've been thinking about switching computer platforms. You did switch computer platforms. I've invested all this money in my stuff for BibleWorks. Is it really worthwhile to do it? I ran BibleWorks on my Mac using what's called Parallels. There's programs that you can do that will emulate Windows stuff on a Mac. I just eventually wanted to go all Mac, and Accordance made that easy. They actually allow for a 10% full-time minister's discount on everything, and they gave me, if I recall, an over 20% discount to make the move. Someone who had worked with them sort of recommended they do that for me, so I'm not sure that everyone can get the 20% part, but they did that. And some of the stuff, I also run Logos. Logos is now available for both platforms. BibleWorks is never going to come into Mac, and Accordance is never going to PC. So, you know, Logos is in between. Logos is on both. I was asked, he said, Accordance seemed to be a little bit limited. It's not. It's got everything that BibleWorks has, and some more, actually. How hard was it to learn? Mac is very intuitive. There was no learning curve for me. Then I was asked, what is the program that I didn't mention last night, and I should have mentioned it. The program I use to take any written format and turn it into something I can listen to in MP3 is called TextSpeech Pro. And how many of you have Logos? Any of you have, only one person in here has Logos, really? You have it as well? I can take any of the books I have in Logos. I have a huge Logos Libronics library, just massive one. And I can take any book in that. Yeah, it's a little bit slow to have to select the text, but if you make it real small, if you make the display real small, you can grab 2 or 3 chapters in a matter of seconds. I dump it into this program and hit export as MP3. And about 5 minutes later, depending on the size of the chunk of text, you'll have about an hour long, again, it depends on how long it is, but you'll have an MP3 sitting there on your desktop that is fully understandable. Yeah, okay, it's a computer talking, but it does not sound like this. The voices have gotten really good if you haven't heard them lately. I even have a British voice for like when I was doing some of Christopher Hitchens stuff. And so it even sounded like Christopher Hitchens. It was great. And I had a Colin Smith as a British student of mine. And when I put his papers in to listen to his papers, I put it and used the British voice, so it sounded like him. So, but it's very, very understandable. Sometimes, okay, it'll mispronounce a word. Big deal. It doesn't speak Greek very well or something like that. But it still works really, really well. So that would be something that's good. Now, then one of the other folks online, we have a question. Can you explain what the one-page reading report is? That's just simply letting you know that you read it. The book review is different than the reading report. That is just it says a one-page reading report will be required from all 4-credit students. The report will be emailed to me. It's just basically saying I read these books. So it's not the review. It's different than the review. Just letting me know. It's sort of assuming that as a Christian, if you send that, you probably actually meant it, and that you're not lying to me. Basically, is all there is to that. We had some good questions that I'm going to get into tonight in regards to apologetic methodology in dealing with atheists. So hopefully, if Brother David, who asked these questions, had a whole series of questions, if I don't get to something tonight, please remind me that I didn't. But I think we'll probably cover most of this stuff as we look at some of the stuff this evening in regards to the new atheism and finish that off and move forward from there. I have a hard time personally going directly into listening to heretics, which is what we're about to do here, without looking at what the Word of God says first. So let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1 for a few moments before we do that. I just feel better that way. I don't know about the rest of you, but it does get trying to my soul at times to spend a lot of time listening to heresy and heretics, but it's so much more enjoyable to look at the Word of God and listen to what the Word of God has to say. When it comes to apologetic methodology, there are two texts that to me are absolutely central. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and Romans chapter 1. And I don't think it's an accident that both of these are right at the beginning of Pauline epistles, where he's in essence going to be giving an apologetic lesson. He's going to be engaging in apologetics. Romans is his thought-out gospel presentation. It's not like Galatians, where he's responding to something and it's sort of jumbled up and emotional. This is a laid out, very clearly Paul recognized, look, if what's here at this place can be solid, then that's going to go out to all sorts of other places in the world, which obviously was a very wise way of thinking. So in Romans 1, he starts with the bad news before he gets to the good news. And here in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, he lays out, I think, a presentation that we could spend the rest of the night on, honestly, and I don't have time to do that. But for me, hearing what Paul says in this text, hearing how it applies today, is one of those instances where, again, the ink smudges. There's nothing dated about this. It's amazing to think that these words were written so long ago. And in fact, I'm gonna go ahead and take this down, put this over here so that we can look at this together. I'll turn the mirroring on. Here we go. All right. I'm going to go ahead and take the ESV out so the Greek's a little bit wider. There we go. I shouldn't have done that, but I could have just gone over to presentation, done the same thing. Oh well, that's life. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. For the word of the cross to the ones who are perishing is moria, foolishness. The message of the cross, the word of the cross, and you and I, when we hear the term cross, because we are using our own theological vocabulary, do not hear how grating that word was in the first century. You should know that, because I emphasized this on a certain cruise you and I were on together. And there was a book we had to read on crucifixion. And I think it's a book that everyone should read. Because for you and I, we boast in the cross. And I don't know about you, I'm so thankful, one of the very first songs I remember hearing as a child was The Old Rugged Cross. Okay, there may be some sentimentality to that, but I'm glad that it was The Old Rugged Cross and not some Beatles song or something like that. That was the first thing I can remember in my upbringing. But we don't hear how jarring these words were when they were first spoken. And so when we see moria, moranos, foolishness, we need to step back into that original context and realize what Paul is saying. The preaching, the word, the message of the cross is to a certain people, to the perishing ones, to those who are perishing. Foolishness. That will always be the case, and any generation of Christians that tries to change this doesn't understand what the word is saying here. And I think we are in a generation that's trying to change this. We don't want it to be foolishness to people. We want it to sound like wisdom to people. We want Christianity to sound like wisdom to people. And that's just not the case. It's just not the way that it is. The preaching of the cross is to those that are perishing foolishness. But, and then you notice the, well, let me ask a question here real quickly. And I don't know that, what was the book about crucifixion? What was the name of that? It was just called Crucifixion by, I'll try to look it up. I had a question about what was the name of the book on crucifixion. It's a European scholar, and the name just off the top of my head isn't coming. But if you can find it for me, let me know, because you'd know which one it was. It was that Pepto-Bismol colored pink. Remember? Anyway, how many of you in the classroom here have had Greek? Let me try this way. How many have not? So we're about 50-50. And I don't think that I can ask folks online, and maybe I can, how many people online have had it. I try to show these things. I'll try to explain when I'm using the languages here. It's not a prerequisite, so I have to explain those things. But you'll notice right here, but to those who are being saved is a direct parallel between the two here. You can see in the form of the participle, the article, so on and so forth. You have two different groups here. Those who are perishing, those who are being saved. The same thing, the word of the cross, is to the one foolishness, to the other group, and it's us. Notice he puts us in there right here. To us, that message is the dunamis of God, the very power of God. One message isn't changed. It's not like, well, the way we talk about the cross to some people is foolishness, and the way we talk about, no. It's the same message. And it's the way that it is interpreted and heard by two different groups, and those groups are described as those who are perishing and those who are being saved. Now, this, be thinking about what this means about your apologetic methodology. When you are approaching the lost, how are you approaching them? There is one apologetic methodology that you approach them as if they are morally neutral, and they are not in and of themselves opposed to the truth, and that they're willing to look at the truth and to understand the truth and so on and so forth. But it seems here that you have in Paul's understanding, to those who are perishing, our message is foolishness. And we dare not change that. To those who are being saved, this is the very power of God. Now that, I think, is like a thesis statement that is then going to be expanded upon in the next few verses. Because especially when we get down to verse 24, I think you're going to see, well, who determines who the perishing ones are and who the being saved ones are? And we will see this comes from the hand of God. So you have a thesis statement, then you have a biblical foundation provided. For it has been written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise ones, and the understanding of the understanding ones I will set aside. And so as a result of that citation, he says, where is the wise one? Where is the learned one, or the scribe, the one who writes and is lettered? Where is the disputer or the debater of this age? That's if there's anything you learn in, do you have a Pauline theology type class or something along those lines? Theology of Paul? Figure this phrase out, this age for Paul. Who is the disputer of this age, who is marked by the wisdom of this age which is passing away? It's not the age of the first century. We are still in this age. It is in the age that is in opposition to God, in opposition to Christ and to his ways. Where is the disputer of this age? Has not God, and look at this verb right here, has not God made foolish? Again, our term moron comes from right here. Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? The wisdom that is marked by the world. That which is not in submission to Christ and under his lordship, God has made it foolish. Now there were just as many people in those days that looked at Christianity as a backwoods hick religion as there are today. Remember Mars Hill? Remember when Paul dared to say something about resurrection? Nothing has changed. That's why I listen to these words and I just go, how can they have been penned so long ago, and yet they have, it's like, it remains absolutely timeless. But you need to understand, God is the subject. God is the one who's doing this. God has made foolish the wisdom of the world. And he's asking Christians, has not? So in other words, this would be something that Christians should understand. Christians should understand God has done something in Jesus Christ that is so outside of the expected norms of what man would say that he has made foolish the wisdom of the world. So why is it, brothers and sisters, that the vast majority of Christian scholarship wants to sound like and act like the world? Could someone explain this to me? Why do we want to look like the world and act like the world and teach like the world and be accepted by the world, even to the point where, let's face it, there is a embarrassment over the proclamation of the Lordship of Christ over all areas of knowledge? It's like this text just isn't there. Do we take seriously the fact that what God has done in Jesus Christ renders foolish the wisdom of the world? If we don't, then most of what I'm going to have to say isn't going to really make much sense to you. But I take it seriously. I don't see how we can avoid it. For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God. So notice, here's the direct object of knowing is God. Through the wisdom of the world, you don't come to know the true God. You might come to know a God, but you don't come to know the true God. I mean, it's right there. And that's in the wisdom of God. In the wisdom of God, the world, by means of, here's diates sophios, through its wisdom, it's not going to come to know God. That's why I sit here and I think about those words that were reported to me from a friend who is very reliable about a Christian apologist. Say, if you want to be an apologist, can't read too much theology, you need to read philosophy. The philosophers of the world need to know how the world is thinking. Well, it's one thing to know how the world's thinking. We have to be able to communicate. We have to, I've taught Christian philosophy of religion many, many times. But the problem that I have with so much of what goes on in the apologetic field today is that the world's philosophy has become preeminent over biblical theology. If this is the Word of God, God's speaking comes first. This is the foundation of our knowledge. And when it comes to the gospel itself, we are told in God's wisdom, He has made foolish the wisdom of the world. In God's wisdom, He has made it so that by the world's wisdom, you're not going to come to know God. Because let's face it, folks. Think with me for a moment. I'm going to become peripatetic, brethren. Have you ever thought about how absolutely amazingly radical our message is? I mean, think about it. We actually tell the world that our God not only just spoke and flung this massive universe into existence, but that He is showing Himself, He's demonstrating Himself and what's going on this one little planet that circles a rather insignificant star, by the way. Our stars, I love solar physics. It's an area I like to read on, but our star is not really all that special. Okay? In the realm of stars, it's a fairly mediocre star. But we're actually telling people that the person who made all of the galaxies in the universe, the billions and billions of galaxies, He actually lived as a carpenter in Israel. Now, folks, if that ain't true, it's absolutely insane. That's radical. We are actually saying our Creator entered into His own creation. And He didn't do so with a whole lot of fanfare. He didn't show up in Athens. He didn't show up in Rome. I mean, we saw last night, Christopher Hitchens really doesn't like this idea of God doing stuff in Israel, because that's just not a really good place to do it. There weren't enough TV cameras around or enough educational stuff going on, whatever. That's a radical claim. We are saying our God entered into His own creation in the person of Jesus Christ, and as such, all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge are found in Him. In a guy who never wrote a book. Well, in a sense, he actually did. He wrote about 66 of them, but that's in a theological sense. He didn't try to he gathered, 12 followers, one of whom betrayed him. That's radical. It's a radical claim. And to try to make that fit into worldly wisdom, to try to make that palatable to a person who remains in rebellion against God, moronic. Foolishness. Foolishness. And I feel sorry for anybody who tries to make that palatable to a rebel sinner. You are going to have to shave off so many rough corners of that what you're going to be left with is such a vanilla message that it won't have any of the power of the gospel of the New Testament. You hear me? There are a lot of people, they realize how radical this really is, and so they back away from the lordship of Christ. They back away from what it really means to say Jesus Christ is Lord in all areas. Jesus Christ is Lord at MIT and Harvard and in the DNA labs and the nuclear physics labs. He's Lord in all those places. And in fact, to engage in those activities while rejecting his lordship is sin. Ever thought about that? What's the beginning of wisdom? What's the beginning of knowledge? How can any creature use the God-given talents that we say were given to him by Jesus Christ, by the triune God, right? I mean, do we really believe the incarnation? Do we really believe this is truly God? Do we really believe that every beat of your heart, every breath of your lungs comes to you as a gift from God? Is he really that involved in his creation? Is he our maker? Isn't that what Colossians 1 says? For by him were all things created, whether heaven and earth, visible or invisible, principalities, powers, dominions, authorities, all things created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Is that not the creator? Does that include us? Certainly does. Again, radical claim. So we're saying that if he is the one who made all things are made for him, then he defines all things, he defines knowledge, and you have no true knowledge outside of who he is. Now, you may have knowledge, but you're stealing from your creator and spitting in his face when you refuse to acknowledge him as your creator and as your Lord when you use that knowledge. That's how radical true Christian epistemology is. And there's a lot of people who find that to be way too radical. And so they come up with a much smaller target, shall we say, because they don't want the, well, offensiveness of this message. But I read what Paul is saying here, and he's saying, look, this is the very wisdom of God. It is in the very wisdom of God that the world, through its wisdom, did not come to know God, but God was pleased through the moria, the foolishness of kerugma, the proclamation, preaching. To do what? To impress unbelievers? To give us something we can go, oh, we're wiser than the world? No. What's the verb right there? For those of you who already know the language, if not, I'll explain. To save. To save. You mean salvation is at the very center of what God is doing? Yep, there it is. To save the ones believing. Not to impress the unbelievers, not to even silence the unbelievers. But God was pleased through the foolishness of proclamation, preaching. I've been faulted many times, and by God's grace, I'll continue to be faulted for doing my best to make sure that in my debates, the gospel is clearly presented. Now, there are some debates I do that's a little bit difficult to get around to that. I mean, you debate Bart Ehrman on textual variation in the 2nd century manuscripts. A little hard, But when I can do so in any meaningful fashion, I want people to understand what is this all about? Through the foolishness of preaching, God saves those who believe. That's what he's doing. God is not overly concerned about the new atheists we're going to be looking at. In the sense that, what does Psalm 2 say? He who sits in the heaven, what does he do? He laughs. And if you're the creator, if you're the maker, if you're the potter, and you happen to run across some pots that are clanking around with signs saying God does not exist, and you made them, what are you going to do? You're probably going to chuckle a little bit, And that's exactly what you have going on here. I started preaching. I'm sorry. It happens once in a while. We'll try to move on. Notice Paul knew his audience. Jews, they seek after signs. Greeks, they seek after Sophia, wisdom. That's what they want. The Jews, Paul knows what he can do to impress a Jewish audience. Paul knows what he could do to impress a Greek audience. He wasn't stupid. He didn't need all those groups out there that come along and do. Have you? Those of you who pastor, I'll come into the office on Sunday morning, and my fellow elder will hand me some of the mail, and we just there's this one big Assemblies of God church in Phoenix, huge, and about once a year they send out this full color poster thing. I mean, what it costs to just print this thing could probably run our church for 6 months, and we always joke about, hey, let's go and attend some of these seminars and learn how to grow the church and you do all the rest of this stuff. And it's this big, huge entertainment thing and all that kind of thing. And every once in a while we'll get something, and there's all these groups that will come in and they'll survey your area for you. They'll tell you exactly what your pastor should look like and what he should wear and how long his sermons should be and what your music should be like. And Fry and I look at each other and go, well, on the looks part, we're dead anyways. Who cares? But they'll tell you exactly how you should do church. You see, Paul didn't need all that. He already knew what his audience wanted. And what does he say? But we proclaim the Messiah crucified. Again, you've got to hear that clanking on the ears of the first century readers and hearers. You've got to. That is just, we preach a crucified Messiah. No wonder he can say, to the Jews a scandalon, to the Gentiles moria. Foolishness. Because it was. That was completely against expectation. That's not attractive. That's not politically correct, whatever terminologies you want to use. Paul knew that he was proclaiming a message that the world would find to be repulsive. Crucifixion was the worst possible way to die. It demonstrated weakness. I mean, to some buff Roman soldier, you want to follow after some guy that was crucified? To some brilliant Athenian philosopher, you're really going to try to make an argument that the God who created all this invaded his own creation to die on a Roman cross? I mean, some British guy in the year 2010 might mock that. Yeah, you're exactly right. So, if what we're left is something that's a scandal and foolishness, what are we going to do? How are we going to get anybody into the church? Well, this is where theology matters. But to the called, but to they who are the chosen, the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christon theo dunamin kai theou sophion, Christ, the Messiah, power of God, wisdom of God. Remember what was the thesis statement that started off verse 18? Those that are perishing, those that are being saved. Preaching the cross, those that are perishing, foolishness. Those that are being saved, very power of God. And here you have the explanation. If it's a scandal to Jews, then you're going to do one of two things. If you're like a lot of folks today, you're going to try to remove the scandal. Let's soften it up. Let's remove the exclusivity of the means by which salvation has been brought to mankind and say that, well, there might be other ways. I mean, there's a lot of, especially since World War II, especially since what happened at Buchenwald and Dachau, and there's been a real, in European theology, fear of the exclusivity of the Christian message. Remember what happened when in the Passion film? Do you remember the big brouhaha about having the scene directly out of Matthew's gospel, where the Jews say, "His blood be upon us," and oh, that's anti-Semitism. You're anti-Jewish. It's right there in Matthew, but you got to realize, for a lot of people, Matthew is anti-Jewish. And so you know what they did? Remember, it was all in subtitles because the whole thing was in Aramaic. Remember? Some of you are saying, "No, I didn't see it. I'm a Christian." But I had to go see it because I had already preached about it. But they would have subtitles to the Aramaic. And if you were listening carefully, if you'd had Hebrew or Aramaic in the past, they still had the Jews say it. They just didn't subtitle it. You could hear it in the language. They just didn't put it in. And that was to avoid some of the scandal. But there is this tremendous embarrassment on the part of so many about the nature of the gospel. And so you try to remove some of that offense. Why do you do that? Mainly because you don't believe in that outline phrase. But to those who are the called, the chosen, the elect, and there are those amongst the Jews and those amongst the Gentiles. To them, same message, same Christ, not foolishness, not scandal. Power of God, wisdom of God. So instead of a scandal, something that stops forward progress, Christ is the power of God. And instead of the foolishness, Christ, the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God, I love that phrase, the foolishness of God is wiser than men. And the weakness of God is stronger than men. And so Paul reminds the Corinthians, look to your own calling, brethren. Not many wise according to the flesh. Not many powerful. Not many well-born people in the upper stratospheres. I mean, what was the big knock on Christianity for hundreds of years? This is where reading the early church helps a little bit. You're all a bunch of slaves. You're the lower classes. Who would want to be a part of that? And Paul embraces that. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to embarrass the things that are wise. The weak things of the world God has chosen that they might embarrass, undo, shame the things that are strong. The non-well-born of the world. God has chosen these things. It's all God's doing. It's all God's wisdom. It's all God's purpose. God is accomplishing His purpose. And who are we to try to undo that? And yet, it does seem to me that so many are embarrassed by the radical nature of this proclamation. And so if we take this, and then and I'll try to be brief here, because I do want to at least get to that one video. We take this, and then we pop over to Romans 1. Let's put these together so I can at least have a solid biblical foundation for where I start in apologetics. Who are you dealing with? Yes, sir. Yes.
Or the author is Martin Hengel.
Martin Hengel, of course. Martin Hengel's work on crucifixion. For those online, it was Martin Hengel. Small book. It's not that long, but it's also not all that flowery and flowy. It's a rather scholarly work. But he goes through pretty much every reference to crucifixion in the ancient literature. And I would highly recommend it on that level to give you an idea of what was thought of this means of execution in the ancient world. Romans chapter 1, it seems to me, I was in my writing recently, I was listening to an 18 CD set by Muhammad al-Sharif, who is a Muslim, and the topic was guiding to Allah. It included sections on how to guide Christians into Islam. That was the primary reason I was listening to it, but I was really taken aback by the fact the vast majority of it was the very kind of marketing stuff that you would get in a lot of seminaries today. You know, the proper use of color in your flyers and you know, all that kind of stuff. Even though there wasn't much they can do about their quote-unquote worship services, but how you invite people, it's just all marketing and business and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The point is, even the Muslims know you have to know something about the audience you're trying to attract. And given that they don't have really the same type of concept of the work of the Spirit of God that we do, I mean, Allah opens whose hearts He wants to open, but it's not the personal kind of theology that we have. They really have to know how to market something. You have to know your audience. And it would seem to me that this text in Romans 1, actually 1, 2, and through 3:20, especially the final sections of chapter 3, which is to close the mouth, before you get to the gospel, I would think this is where everybody would be going first. But it does seem to me that one predominant and popular apologetic methodology has to explain Romans 1 away rather than going to Romans 1 to find its explanation of the nature of man, the person you're trying to do apologetics to. You're trying to give a defense to. You all know the text, and I'm not going to try to open all of it up. But it is important to note that God's wrath is being revealed, present tense, from heaven against all the unrighteousness and ungodliness of men. And then it's right at the end of verse 18 that we have, I think, the key apologetic participle. The ones who are, and you'll notice, you'll notice right here, we have a plural genitive article. And what it is going with is right here, kata kanton. So when you have an article separated by all these words, you're getting a book ending. The truth in unrighteousness suppressing ones. So it gives you a phrase, okay? Now this term, kata kanton, means to hold down, to suppress. You might think of trying to suppress a cough. I mean, if you've ever had one of those horrible infections where you just can't stop, but you're always trying to suppress something. I think a better way is to think of trying to hold down a beach ball or a soccer ball or something like that in a pool. Ever tried to do that? And you got to keep at it because it wants up. There is a force constantly being exerted against you, and eventually you just get so tired you're gonna let it do its thing. This is descriptive of the natural man who remains in rebellion against his Creator. Paul is saying that man has truth, but what does man do with truth? He suppresses it. He holds it down. There is an exertion being expended. There's energy being expended by the rebel sinner to suppress this truth. Now you might say, well, wait a minute. Think of all the ways in which people do this. I mean, let's just look at the groups that we're talking about in this class. What is common between Christopher Hitchens, Michael Shermer, Sam Harris, Shabir Ali, Zakir Naik, Jerry Matitix, Scott Hahn, Robert Sungenis, and the current prophet of the Mormon Church. Think about all the differences between these men. Massive differences. And yet there is a commonality. There is a suppression of God's truth. It can be in an atheistic fashion. It can be through apathy. It can be through all the activities of man where he amuses himself. You do know what muse means, right? To think and to ponder. So amuse means to not think or ponder. We spend billions every year to do what? To not think. That's what amusement is. To not think. And yeah, when you're flying with your head upside down inside some kind of, fun roller coaster someplace, I'm only thinking about one thing. Am I going to get off this thing in one piece? I'm not thinking about, the deep things of God or anything else. I'm amused, no two ways about it. But that is a way of suppression. And then you have religious suppression. You have religious holding down of the truth of God through the worship of false gods. That's just as much a part of this suppression as anything else is. And so he goes on to say, because that which is known about God is manifest either in them or amongst them. It can be taken either way. For God is the one who manifested it to them. God has made a revelation of certain things, as we see in verse 20, his divine nature and character, so that men are, and look at this word right here, anapologetus. Anapologetus. Do you see apologetics there? Here is apologetics, and then you have the alpha privative put on the beginning. Without a defense, without an excuse that can be given an ordered defense of their denial of the existence of God. So the revelation that's been given is not a revelation. I'm not one of those folks who believes in the gospel and the stars and, the Trinity is revealed in this way and the redemptive work of the cross and all the rest of this stuff. I know there are people that get into that. What Paul says is his divine nature, his divine attributes have been revealed through what has been made so that men know that they should give thanks to God, but they refuse to do so. That's his argument. So the point is this. If our audience to whom we are seeking to give a defense is suppressing the truth of God, then what should be our approach? For some reason, the vast majority of apologists think this is the approach. Hold your notepad down, brother. Suppress your notepad. I'm going to come along and I'm going to try to put some more stuff for him to do what? If I manage to get this under here, what's he going to do with it? He's going to continue to suppress it. So the idea is, well, I'm going to give you more truth to suppress. Well, what are you going to do with that truth? You're going to suppress it. As if they're somehow missing some vital element of truth that would go, oh, God does exist. If I could just come up with what he's missing. I say that what you do is, hold your notepad down. What you do is you start peeling up his fingers. Because he's not going to like that. Because if you want to hold this down, you're not going to like if I come along and I start peeling your fingers up. I start making it impossible for you to continue suppressing what you desperately need to continue to suppress to remain the autonomous creature you think you are. Because you, in your innermost being, don't want to deal with the God you know is there. And so I believe the task of the apologist is to come along and start peeling up those fingers. Now, he's not going to like that. He's not going to find that enjoyable. He's not going to find that to be something that he's going to recommend. I like this person who's doing this to me. You know? But that's where we go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and we discover how is it that God peels the fingers up? Through the foolishness of preaching. Oh, but I don't like that. Well, that's the power that's been given to us, brothers and sisters. And if you want the conversion of a soul to be a divine act and not the result of your wisdom and your argumentation, then you've got to go with the power God has given to us. And that is the proclamation of the gospel. Now, am I sitting up here saying, oh, we shouldn't answer their objections? No, I do it all the time. But I do it to prepare the way to communicate what? Clearly, the gospel. That's from my perspective. As far as I can see biblically, the only way you can make a meaningful presentation. So, with that, I think I'm right on time here because we're supposed to go to 6:15, right? I think I'll have just enough time to squeeze this in. This is, oh, I wanted to change how I did this so it would look better. I apologize. Let's turn this off. There we go. This is my opening statement in the debate that I had with the president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation up in Madison, Wisconsin. This was at the University of Illinois. This is the fellow I was talking to you about last night. His name is Dan Barker. I want to play for you my opening statement because how many of you have heard the Bonson-Stein debate? All right, most of you have heard the Bonson-Stein debate. Unfortunately, there were no video cameras there, and the audio quality has never been all that good, and they've run it through every computer program known to man to get us what we've got, but that was 1985, I think, and that's just the way it was. I'm not Greg Bonson. I knew Greg Bonson. In fact, how many of you ever heard Greg's debates with the two homosexuals he did in California? Ever heard the debates he had with them? He got to do those because he called me. He was scheduled to debate Jerry Matitix in Omaha, Nebraska in 1992. And the opportunities to do those homosexual debates came up. So he called me and asked if I would fly up and debate Jerry in his place, and I did, on Sola Scriptura and Justification by Faith. About froze to death. It was terrible. But anyway, so we met a few times and lost a great man when he passed away at the end of 1995. I'm not Greg Bonson, and I tried in this presentation to model a presuppositional approach that at the same time makes use of evidence without ever granting to man his autonomy to judge these things. So I present, for example, evidence of the existence of God in the sense that this is material that my opponent will not be able to consistently explain. But I also try to make sure I'm not saying, therefore, I'm just throwing evidence out there and you weigh the evidence. That's not what I was saying. So try to make that balanced. I believe it's 20 minutes long, and I might go 5 minutes long on that, so I apologize if we do that, but I'll make it up on the other side. But here is my presentation from the debate at the University of Illinois. This was about not quite 2 years ago on the existence of God. Well, thank you very much for having me here this evening. It is truly an honor to be with you at the University of Illinois. I appreciate the invitation, and I thank Dan Barker for being here this evening as well. Our subject this evening is very, very important. Dan and I were noting that this is not the first time that we have met. In fact, we met a long time ago on the Tom Leykis show in Phoenix, Arizona. And one thing that we both immediately noticed is that both of us had a whole lot more hair than we do today. And the irony, of course, of that is the fact that that indicates that time is passing. And that passage of time indicates that we debate this evening on the precipice of eternity. None of us know what tomorrow will bring. Therefore, what we are debating should not be a mere intellectual exercise for anyone this evening. From the Christian worldview, we are speaking about the very issues of life itself. The audience tonight, those who are here in the auditorium, those who will be listening later by recording, you are the ones who cannot be neutral about the subject that we are looking at this evening. You are the judges of the debate. And please keep in mind, even though we live in a postmodern paradigm today, postmodernism does not encourage deep critical thought. It often confuses emotion with truth, feelings with logic. I hope you will listen very carefully to the presentations as they are made this evening. I would like to challenge everyone in the audience to examine your own worldview this evening. Let this be a beginning, not an end for you. Examine your worldview. Examine it for consistency. Test the debaters. Test Mr. Barker and myself as to who is consistent with their own worldview. Who will have to borrow from the other's worldview? Which worldview will accord with the reality that we find around us? Those are some of the questions we must ask this evening. Now, the biblical teaching is that everyone listening to this debate knows that the God of Scripture lives. This knowledge may not be explicit in the sense of being able to articulate the Trinity, for example, but it is fundamental to our debate this evening to understand why a Christian believes this to be the case and why it is relevant to our encounter. Mr. Barker has said that he knows the Christian God does not exist. He will often tell us that morality, by definition, refers to behavior that minimizes harm. Mr. Barker has a naturalistic materialist worldview that causes him to think and reason in a particular fashion. We will examine the consistency of his ability to be able to offer such definitions later on. But for now, I must define the biblical view before we can examine it for consistency. We read in the Christian scriptures, "For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who are suppressing," present tense, "the truth by means of unrighteousness. For that which is known about God is evident within them, because God has made it evident to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened." Now please notice that men know God exists, but due to their sin and rebellion, they suppress this knowledge. The revelation of God in creation, both outwardly and inwardly, is sufficient to render man accountable to God, to give thanks and to give honor. The clarity of this revelation renders all men unapologetus, that is, without an apologetic. This means that Mr. Barker will not be able to argue against the God who has placed clear evidence of his existence in and all around Mr. Barker. Oh, but wait, surely he will do so. Yes, he will try, but here is one of the keys to the debate. Will Mr. Barker be able to do this without borrowing from God's existence to do so? I submit he will not. As hard as Dan has tried for over 25 years now, his suppression of the knowledge of God leads inevitably to utter futility and self-contradiction. The biblical worldview places the triune God at the center of all things. As the creator, his purpose, his decree, his intention determines the meaning, purpose, and identity of all things, including man. To truly know things as they are in God's created order, man cannot put himself in the center of the diagram, demoting God to just one other fact of knowledge. Instead, to know truly and properly, mankind must see himself as a creature in his Creator's world, and hence must know things only as they are related to God. To have true, proper knowledge, then, I must know the creation only as I relate to the Creator. When I know law, or morality, or love, or history, as it is properly defined by the Creator, as I see these in light of the triune God's eternal decree, then I have true and proper knowledge of these things. When man is placed in the center, as is necessary in a naturalistic materialist worldview, all things become objects of human knowledge defined by the creature, including God. Man, by definition, has to define God in a way that fits his own role in the universe. Further, the unity, harmony, and consistency of knowledge that comes from having the triune God at the center, his sovereign his sovereign decree defining the creation is lost, and each man or woman becomes the ultimate authority in defining reality. Now, the thesis statement specifically refers to the triune God. Why the triune God? First and foremost, because the Trinity is biblical. I know Mr. Barker does not believe that, but I'd be happy to respond to any objections he might raise to that. Secondly, because of the centrality of Christ to the Christian worldview. Specifically, I refer to, for example, this text from the book of Colossians. For by him all things were created. This is referring to Jesus. Both in the heavens and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Now, this is a radical claim. Certainly, it is the Christian message that the Creator himself, to bring about his own glory and the salvation of an undeserving people, entered into his own creation in the person of Jesus Christ. This means that there are no neutral facts. There is no neutral ground upon which to stand. A fact, if it is a fact, is so because God made it to be so. To pretend otherwise is to compromise the Christian faith. That means I insist that when Dan Barker seeks to reason logically while denying his Creator, he is not only in self-denial, he has to borrow from my worldview to make it work. While Mr. Barker does not believe he has to give a justification for the laws of logic, I leave it to the listener to decide if such vital matters can be left to mere brute facts, saying, well, that's just the way that it is. When a consistent biblical Christian presents the all-encompassing claims of Christianity in debate with most atheists, including Dan Barker, the atheist assumes that since we do not start with theistic proofs, which invite the creature to judge God and which ignore the suppression of the knowledge of God already present in the unbeliever, that we have abandoned the use of evidence and that we are simply presupposing the truth of Christianity. This is simply not the case. I am saying everything that is true is because God created it. Hence, all evidence points to God, and that is why the unbeliever has to work so hard at suppressing the knowledge. Further, I am not suggesting that you simply presuppose Christianity. The issue has to do with the presuppositions one brings to all the data and the myth that anyone is epistemologically and morally neutral about the existence of God. Now, a few years ago, Dan Barker made the following claim. He said, quote, however, when it comes to a particular definition of God, such as the Christian God or the Islamic God, I go further than just the negative, soft, lowercase atheism, and I make the positive claim that that particular God does not exist. In that case, I am an uppercase atheist, especially when it comes to the gods of the revealed religions. I am convinced, and I claim to know, that those gods, the Christian God, Allah, does not exist. It is not a belief, it is a claim of knowledge. Such a God does not exist. This means Dan is a hard atheist, a capital A atheist in our debate this evening. So how does one decide between these two positions? Well, there's a good question. First of all, I would suggest the demonstration of the consistency of one's own worldview. One must demonstrate the consistency of one's own worldview. One must ground logic, reason, etc., in one's own worldview. Secondly, by providing an internal critique of competing worldviews. Providing an internal critique of competing worldviews. And finally, through the demonstration of the explanatory power of one's worldview in light of known reality. Now, I refer this as secondary evidence. It is not primary evidence, but it is relevant to the topic that we have this evening. So you see, the reason we must approach this issue presuppositionally can be seen by recognizing the impossibility of demonstrating God's existence to a dogmatic materialist like Dan Barker. From a Christian perspective, Dan has no right to climb up upon the seat of judgment, wrap the robes of the cosmic jurist around himself, and act as judge. For when anyone brings evidence before Judge Barker of the existence of anything outside the materialistic realm, he simply bangs the gavel and says, evidence dismissed. So we are left with the impossible task of demonstrating the existence of a non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material being, while being limited only to spatial, temporal, and material evidence. The impossibility of the task and the circularity of the position is obvious. Further, while Mr. Barker sits as judge, as a materialist, and as a functionalist, who denies the existence of the laws of logic as abstract and universal entities reflecting the order of the creation, he can only offer us, as his ultimate authority, his own cognitive processes, his own mind.
I would like to argue that Mr. Barker lost the debate tonight by walking in the room. His expectation that we can engage in logic-based rational dialogue in a random world where the laws of logic are no more than the result of the action of the sodium-potassium pumps inside layers of phospholipids inside the bony structure that comprises Mr. Barker's head makes no sense given his naturalistic materialism. Indeed, Mr. Barker assures us that laws of logic are no more universal or abstract than digestion in the stomach, a confusion of categories that is truly stunning. But Mr. Barker's functionalism must be his final authority, so he cannot give us any higher justification for any answer he may give us than this. The neurons in his brain say so, for now anyway. Atoms banging around, electrical impulses and axons, nothing more. In fact, in a debate with Paul Manata, Dan admitted that in the cosmic perspective, humans are no more important than broccoli, resulting in a fascinating discussion of cosmic broccoli. The point, of course, is that the debate we are having this evening is really absurd from a materialistic perspective. One piece of cosmic broccoli arguing with another when there is no transcendent reality, no laws of logic binding upon both, no truths that remain valid and important long after the cosmic broccoli has become part of the cosmic salad, is the ultimate example of futility. The fact that we all sit here this evening expecting rational discourse that follows the laws of logic is to be expected on Christian grounds. It is as silly as the invasion of the cosmic broccoli from the materialist perspective. Now, let's look at solid, strong evidence of the existence of the triune God, not as a neutral fact from which I suggest we reason to God, but as a fact of reality that can only make sense in light of God's existence, and as a fact that will illustrate the materialist's unwillingness to allow for conclusions that challenge their worldview. What you see on the screen right now is here we have what is called F1 ATPase. It is a structure found in living cells in the mitochondria. It is a vital structure in cellular respiration. For by it, ADP, adenosine diphosphate, is converted back into ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the universal power source of most bodily systems. Through an ingenious system, it uses ionic flow to create mechanical power, very similar to the turbines we use to generate hydroelectric power. As the mechanism turns, powered by proton movement across a gradient, it moves highly specific protein molecules, molecules that have to have a very specific ordered shape that, due to their motion, attach a phosphate molecule to ADP, reconstituting ATP, which is then utilized by the body. Not only is the complexity beautiful, but it is so plainly purposeful, so plainly designed, that no one can possibly see this as a mere result of the movement of atoms over time. Remember, this is just one of the many cellular organelles that are basic to life itself. We can't hope for natural selection to explain how something this grand came into existence. It is far beyond the technology found, for example, in my BlackBerry Storm over on my table over there, or the cell phone that you have with you, and far beyond anything that we can do even with our most advanced technology today. Here we have a tremendously simplified graphic of protein synthesis in the cell using DNA, RNA polymerase, messenger RNA, transfer RNA, ribosomes, etc. Again, the complexity of this mechanism is mind-boggling. This is not, as Mr. Barker has erroneously claimed in the past, similar to complex crystals or wind-shaped sand dunes. No, this is specific informational complexity on a level that rivals our best computers and on a physical scale so infinitesimal we are left in awestruck wonder every time we look into our own selves. Amazingly, Mr. Barker can look at this clear informational complexity and tell us that this is not evidence of an intelligent, wise designer. This is nothing more than the report one would make after a storm has passed through. What can explain such a willingness to reject such obvious evidence of purposeful, intentional, and intelligent design? There have been recent developments. One recent book that came out last year that is quite fascinating is entitled Why Us by James LeFanu. And he addresses what has happened since the decade of the brain and the Human Genome Project. And I thought this was very relevant to our debate this evening. He wrote, "Nonetheless, there must be a reason why those genome projects prove so uninformative about the form and attributes of living things, or why the decade of the brain should have fallen so far short of explaining the mind. There is a powerful impression that science has been looking in the the wrong place, seeking to resolve questions whose answers lie somehow outside its domain. He continues by saying, this is not just a matter of science not yet knowing all the facts. Rather, there is the sense that something of immense importance is missing that might transform the bare bones of genes into the wondrous diversity of the living world and the monotonous electrical firing of the neurons of the brain into the vast spectrum of sensations and ideas of the human mind. What might that missing element be? One of the tragedies of modern Western academia has been the institutional establishment of a religious dogma that brooks no dissent, that being neo-Darwinian naturalistic materialism. These vital questions cannot even be asked by the dogmatic materialist. The answer must be in the genes. There can't be something different about mankind that gives rise to the mind. We have to be just like a tapeworm or like broccoli. Our religion says so. Long ago, Blaise Pascal, the brilliant mathematician and philosopher, said, reason's last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things which are beyond it. It is merely feeble if it does not go as far as to realize that. And reflecting those same thoughts, the Puritan John Flavel said, I know there is nothing in the word or in the works of God that is repugnant to sound reason, but there are some things in both which are opposite to carnal reason, as well as above right reason. And therefore our reason never shows itself more unreasonable than in summoning those things to its bar which transcend its sphere and capacity. Now, I want to be very, very clear on one thing this evening. While our debate places you, the audience, in the position of judging, I would be remiss in a most severe way if I did not reject in the strongest possible terms the idea that we as creatures have the right to judge the existence of our Creator. The verdict of this debate was given when God said, let there be light. The issue tonight is whether we will live in accord with that verdict or not. So what is the reality in our closing moments of this opening statement? If your worldview cannot give a justification for why we are here tonight, laws of logic, reason, transcendent meaning, it should be rejected. If your worldview cannot accord with the reality of the world and human existence, it should be rejected. The triune God, as the timeless, unchanging creator of all things, gives meaning through his eternal decree to all things in space and time. We as creatures find our truest selves only when we are in the proper relationship to our Creator, so that our intellectual pursuits are undertaken under his lordship, where we as creatures have the tremendous privilege of thinking God's thoughts after him. This is the great irony of those who promote what they call free thought. Creatures who rebel against their own nature and who embrace dogmatic materialism are not free at all. They are bound to self-deception and as such are condemned to anything but free thought. Their worldview precludes a true, holistic, harmonious knowledge of God's creation around them. The Christian, however, is seeing himself or herself for what we are in reality, the creatures of a personal, eternal sovereign, can, from the peace that comes through faith in Jesus Christ, experience the fullness of our humanity as God intended us to, all to his glory. Thank you very much.
So, there is the presentation I made at the debate. We have gone 5 minutes over our time. We will interact with you as to what you thought of that when we come back from our dinner break. So let's go ahead and take that break.